Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. In 2002, the BBC conducted a poll to determine whom the United Kingdom public considered the greatest 100 Britons. Who topped the list? William Shakespeare? Charles Darwin? Sir Isaac Newton? Number one was former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the gallant leader who rallied the Brits to stand up and defeat Hitler. Our guest today has a different opinion, suggesting that over the last 40 years, Churchill's legacy has been mythologized and elevated in standing by those who gaslight his imperial crimes, racism, cruelty, and incompetence. So why the hero worship of Churchill? Let's discuss his times and crimes with our guest, Tariq Ali. Well, warm greetings. I am so excited to be in your company, Tariq Ali, and I've been looking forward to this. Greg and I devoured your book, and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much. Likewise.
For those that don't know you, you are a writer, activist, public intellectual, and by writer, both fiction and nonfiction. And you wrote a wonderful book on Churchill. Tell me about why did you decide to bring Churchill up after all these years?
Good question. The late Mike Davis, who died some weeks ago, was very keen and kept pressing me to write a book on Churchill. He said, you could do it. I still needed persuading, but then a movement began of young people, decolonizers and others, who started daubing Churchill's statue with red paint, who painted the Churchill College at Cambridge University, accusing Churchill of racism. And suddenly there was a huge attack on them largely by the right-wing tabloid press and media. And it suddenly made me realize that Churchill had become such an icon, such a sort of household god for the Conservative Party, and not just them, that people had forgotten the real history, and that something needed to be done. So for me, it was a question of how to write the book. There were, as I've written in the introduction, the libraries are full of books on Churchill. There is his own work, there's works by his epigones, there's work by all sorts of people. And it was a puzzle as to how to write it. And there are some good biographies as well. I mean, one shouldn't forget that. Clive Ponting's biography in particular is an old favorite of mine. And there are many other specialist books on various aspects of his leadership, which are also critical. But what you didn't have was a book that placed Churchill in his times and placed him in a world in which he grew up and in which his family acquired great fame, and to explain what made him what he was. So it wasn't an ordinary biography, and that's why the book is called Churchill, His Times, His Crimes. And the times are extremely important because without it, you can't understand the crimes that were committed. So that's why I decided to write it. And, it's been out since May this year. And we'll be having a paperback in April, and it's done reasonably well. It's been reviewed. It's been by the right wing. The liberals have tended to ignore it. So, for instance, The New York Times and The Guardian in Britain, which usually review my books, have completely ignored it,
Oh my.
as has the Washington Post, etc. So the sort of liberal media doesn't want to tackle it, even to do a critical review, whereas the right-wing press has gone for it, attacked it, said it's an outrage, which is boomeranged because it's alerted people to the fact that the book is out. And I'm pleased to say it's doing reasonably well.
Yeah, I have I follow the Hillsdale College, which is has a publication called Empress. This is a pretty influential right-wing college in the in our country that any politician that wants to run for president ends up showing up there, and they have a whole special on Winston Churchill and how the left is condemning him because they obviously just don't know history. And I'll just give you a small example of a few things. When they talked about bombing the Irish, he said, well, I wasn't really interested in doing that. I just wanted to kind of control them. Poison gas, I was only talking about tear gas. The left doesn't get that right about tear gas. And it just goes on and on with this revisionist history that people are being too hard on him. And and partially I was part of that problem too. I remember reading Splendid Vile and having a thought, well, he was kind of a little bit problematic in his youth, but he really rallied and saved the war. And then the Brits were mean to him after the war and kind of kicked him to the curb. And my British friend, who I lent your book to, who was he said that's wrong. He was a horrible person, and we all knew he was horrible. And that the fact that you're elevating him to be this person that saved the Second World War is wrong. He was bad before, he was bad after, and don't feel sorry for him. And
let me ask a question. How did he become such a lightning rod? If you ask people in this country more than probably in the UK about figures in UK history, they would cite royalty and they would cite Winston Churchill. That's really all they know. And what made him such a significant figure that the left and the right fight over?
Well, I think the only thing that did this was his decision to rearm Britain just before the Second World War, a few years before the Second World War. He fought for that. And when other politicians were extremely nervous, for a variety of reasons. One, that many conservatives actually were very sympathetic to the fascists. Churchill himself was a great admirer of Mussolini and had quite a few good words to say about Hitler as well, including phrases like, had Britain been subjected to what Germany's been subjected to after the First World War, I would hope very much that our country managed to produce someone as powerful and strong and patriotic as Herr Hitler. I mean, I haven't got it in front of me, but it's a well-known quotation. So there was genuine sympathy for the fascists in Europe by the conservatives in Europe, including Churchill, who saw the main enemy always as the Russian Revolution of 1917. They saw that as the main enemy. That is the enemy that had to be wiped out. And this was also, of course, Woodrow Wilson's position. I mean, the first committee, secret committee set up to monitor what was going on in Russia was set up by Woodrow Wilson. So Churchill wasn't even original about that. But that his claim to fame came when the rest of Europe collapsed and Britain held together. Had the Germans taken, Roosevelt was pretty convinced that the Germans might take Britain, and he suggested to Churchill that the British Navy be sent to American shores to be kept there till times improved. But what saved Churchill, actually, which I describe in my book in some detail, was Hitler's decision not to capture the entire expeditionary force of the British at Dunkirk. And the Dunkirk spirit, which they go on about, I mean, the sad reality about that is that the Germans decided to leave the British Empire alone for the time being, that they had other things to do, including attacking Russia and the Soviet Union. And so Britain could wait. His armies were within miles, 10 miles of taking Dunkirk, and that would have been that. If they'd taken Dunkirk and captured the expeditionary force, the Germans could have taken Britain without any doubt. I mean, but he decided not to do it. And the German generals, General Guderian in particular, were enraged, saying, what the hell is he up to? We're almost there. But the order was stop, no forward movement whatsoever. That's what saved Churchill. There wasn't anything else, really. It was the German strategy and tactics in relation to Russia in the Second World War. So it's, so the mythology was created, and the English are, great geniuses in mythology and creating myths. And the myth was created that we saved the war, we saved Britain, we won the war, which is also false. I mean, the war, if one is to be utterly ruthless about stating facts, was won by two sources. It was won by the manpower of the Red Army of the Soviet Union, two key battles, Stalingrad and Kursk. Kursk was the largest tank battle of the Second World War. The Germans suffered a huge defeat. It was that broke the backbone of the Third Reich, was the battlefields in the East. And the second, and equally important on some levels, was the new rising United States military industry, which kept on producing weapons which were being sent both to Russia and to other parts of the world to fight the fascists. And they did it for their own reasons, but they did it. And the United States was the only country at the time which was at peace. It had never known a war, it had not been attacked, so it could do all this without any fear of the fascists or the either in Europe and even later after Pearl Harbor in Japan. I mean, Pearl Harbor made it absolutely essential that the alliance, the Axis powers, had to be defeated. But even prior to that, arms were being made ready by Roosevelt to supply his allies with. So if the question is asked, who won the war? In different ways, the war was won by the Red Army and the American arms industry. That's the honest truth. Britain played very little part in it. I mean, I don't want to, they fought, of course, and they won some battles and lost others. I wouldn't want to detract that from them or from the resistance movements in Europe. Far from it. But I'm just saying it's exaggerated, very strongly exaggerated, the role that Churchill played. And to add to add to that, another point, which is that Churchill, as your friend said to you, you recounted a few minutes ago, was hated. He was hated as a conservative and as someone who had made no secret of his own hatred for the more militant sectors of the British working classes. Churchill was hostile to them, hostile to their strikes, fought very hard against the general strike of 1926, brought Britain back onto the gold standard as Chancellor of the Exchequer. So internally, he was hated as well, especially in Wales, where the miners, troops were sent to deal with the miners during peacetime, in between the wars. And so this came to a head after the Second World War, when British workers largely, but not them alone, many others too, decided enough is enough. Okay, the war's over, we're glad we won it, but we are not going to vote for Churchill. So Churchill was defeated in 1944 in the elections, 44-45, precisely because he was disliked. Otherwise, there's no way of understanding what happened. And his apologists say, oh, people were attacking the Tories, not him. No, they were attacking him and the Tories who supported him. That's why Labour won that tremendous victory in 1945.
Churchill was a racist. I think that's not overstatement at all.
A controversial statement.
No. That's not a controversial statement. And that history of him thinking that these white privileged European British people were better than other people was a theme that ran through his life. And he had a specific disdain for India. And said some horrible things about the Indian people. The manner in which he dealt with India was an absolute war crime, and your book describes that accurately. This was a thriving community, a thriving country before Britain got involved with their colonialist expansion, and they literally just raped this country of wealth for many, many decades, and probably India deserves reparations. I don't know. Tell me about that, his involvement with that, and how he was complicit in.
But Churchill, well, look, the first thing about Churchill is that he was a rock-hard imperialist, treating the racism which he espoused, and which large numbers of other people espoused, not just him, and not just in the Conservative Party. There was a lot of racism in the Labour Party. Labour intellectuals in the Fabian Society said things very similar to Churchill, that we are a superior race. You can find them. People try not to talk about them, but they're all there. And Churchill was very open about it, saying we are a superior, high-grade race, and appealing to the United States that, it'll be our duty to defend this high-grade race after the war as well, which shocked Roosevelt's Vice President Wallace, who said there are lots of people in this country who wouldn't go along with that view that white people are superior. I mean, knowing his own history and the history of white supremacy in the United States. But Churchill, that never stopped Churchill. India was their biggest gain in imperial terms. It was a subcontinent. It was situated in Asia, on the edge of the Chinese Empire, on the edge of the Japanese Empire. It was absolutely key. And once they'd got their hands on it, they were determined to hang on to it. I mean, they crushed the Great Uprising of 1857 very brutally indeed. And after that, racism and apartheid was introduced throughout India by the British. Literally there were signs saying Indians and dogs not allowed on benches and stuff like that. So that's how they decided to rule. They felt the only way they could rule was through racial superiority. And then during the Second World War, there was the beginnings of a famine in Bengal, one of the largest provinces in the east, with a long-standing culture of its own. And Churchill by that time was so totally besotted by the war in Europe that they said, we can't spare the rice for the Bengali people. Which was not true, by the way. Rice could have been spared, and it could have been imported from neighboring countries. They turned that down in some cases. And people died. The figures we still don't know, because in many cases, the bodies of the poor are just burnt. They're not counted because, you just want to get rid of the bodies. So whether it's 3, 4, 5 million, we will never have the exact figures, but let's say between 3 and 4 million. It's a horrendous figure. When we think that, Hitler and his allies wiped out 6 million Jews during the war, the killing of 4 million or 4 million plus Indians is a crime on a similar scale. Right. And it's not the case that the British authorities in India were totally in favor of it. The British Viceroy, Lord Wavell, and his wife were horrified. Lady Wavell went and saw conditions. She said, "I have never seen human beings like this. They're like animals. That's how they're being treated." And there was a strong correspondence that Churchill was adamant. Not just Churchill, I have to keep saying this because people tend to forget, but the entire War Cabinet, including Attlee and including most of the Labour members of that cabinet, they didn't like it, but they said it had to be pushed through. And when Wavell said we can develop plans to save some people, he was vetoed. So people on the ground were deeply shaken by these events, and it was never forgotten. And when Churchill was told, "Look, millions are starving to death," and he said at I think, Lord Mayor's banquet, that people say millions are starving to death in India because of the shortage of rice. Gandhi's still alive, isn't he? Meaning, this is the Prime Minister of wartime Britain. Well, so it's an appalling part of British history what they did in India, actually, not just in Bengal, but other parts of the country as well. And it's now coming to light. Lots of people are writing about it.
Right. And here's some facts on that when Britain got involved with India, India was a wealthy country. 20% of all the world's GDP was from India. And they literally just extracted that wealth. When they left, when they left, the life expectancy was 27 years old. Their literacy rate was only 17%. They were spending as much money in all of India as New York City was spending on education. They just extracted the wealth. And the question that I have is, what did the Queen know? I mean, what were other people had to know how horrible this situation was? And so it isn't just Churchill; it's the whole colonial system.
It's the entire system.
It's the entire system.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It depends which queen you're referring to. Queen Victoria, of course, who presided over the British Empire at its peak, was kept informed. She knew everything that was going on, whether it was in India or it was in Ireland. The palace was informed, and there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that they expressed any discontent. Later, during the war, it was King George VI, the father of the Queen, who died only recently. They knew. They were part and parcel of the empire. The monarchy formed a pretty crucial part, a crucial pillar of the British Empire. They were used, they knew about the atrocities that were taking place, they were photographed, for instance, to give you an example, with happy smiling children in Kenya who were brought to where they were staying to shake hands and smile and do little dances, when at the same time, as Caroline Elkins, a very distinguished American historian, has written 2 books on this now. There were gulags in Kenya, concentration camps where Kenyan patriots were being tortured and killed. And so it's not just India, it's Africa as well, both East Africa and South Africa. So, of course, the royal family was deeply imbricated in this, as they were in slavery.
Yeah, his Cold War role, he's out of power, and yet he's an icon in the Cold War. In this country, people remember his Iron Curtain speech, which came at a opportune time for the McCarthyites and the other warmongers.
Yeah, basically Churchill understood sooner than some Brits politicians that the game was up, that they may have technically won the Second World War, but effectively the British Empire couldn't hold out on its own, and he decided that the best thing to do was to hand over the empire to the United States. And this they proceeded to do. I mean, Saudi Arabia and Saudi oil was handed to Roosevelt by the Brits in the middle of the war, even before the war was over. And then slowly, gradually, Egypt, Iran, etc., were handed over, and then the United States did the same in trying to go to save the French Empire in Vietnam, getting themselves involved in a war from where they couldn't come out for a long, long time, and in which they lost over 50,000 people themselves. Then similar things were done in Indonesia after the Dutch left. The US tried to control it with horrific consequences for the Indonesian people, and a military coup that lasted a long, long time. So Churchill was totally supportive of all this. We should have no doubts, and McCarthyism was a necessary concomitant of this, that we have to do this because they are evil people. They threaten our country. Forgotten very rapidly were they evil when they were destroying the Third Reich in Europe? Were they evil when they were completely engaged in the destruction of fascism? And so McCarthyism, and a milder version of it, existed in Britain too under the Labour government, was to destroy all dissent, whether people, as we know, whether people were communists or not, or sympathizers or socialists or progressive liberals, they were all tarred with the same brush. I mean, the purges in Hollywood, of course, have now become a semi-myth on their own, but they were pretty nasty. And I thought it was very well captured, the absurdity and craziness of it all in Woody Allen's film, The Front, where he makes money by getting scripts from banned Hollywood writers and then and takes them to the studios who publish them under his name. I mean, it's a sort of fictionalized story, but it did happen to a certain extent, and so it was a very bad period, the Cold War period, and now we're having a new Cold War, which Churchill would certainly have supported. But I just basically think that we shouldn't idealize politicians, Even the good ones sometimes do bad things, though Churchill was certainly not a good one and got away with murder in the literal sense of the word.
Yeah, if you go back to that period, 1945, and the beginnings, the roots of the Cold War, imperialism shifted. It's an interesting time because the anti-colonial movement was extremely strong, and in a decade or so, most of the former colonies were no longer colonies; they were independent. And you put your finger on the fact that the U.S. then kind of took over the responsibility the empire used to have, but in a new form. Was it not a new form? I mean, a new form of imperialism?
It was. The United States didn't like the idea of occupying countries directly. That's what they resisted. They had done it in the Philippines. The results hadn't been too good. Mark Twain had set up and others, the James brothers, had set up the Anti-Imperialist League. There was a huge outcry by liberals against what the United States was up to in the Philippines and in parts of Central America. And so there was a constant debate, and by and large, when the US took over the British, French, and Dutch empires, they decided that the way they were going to do it was by creating local relays. So largely the local armies, right-wing politicians, worked for them, with the United States only intervening when they felt that was the only way to save the country and occupying it, like South Korea remains occupied to this day. And Vietnam was occupied from 1961, 62 till 1975. But Japan is occupied, Korea is occupied, the US troops there. But they don't run the country itself. They have troops to make sure that the governments they support stay in power. But that's old European form of colonialism. They didn't go in for. And from their point of view, it was a clever thing. I mean, they'd have been completely bogged down had they tried to occupy sort of semi-continents in different parts of the globe.
I want to go back to the Kenya situation with Carolyn Elkins' book, Imperial Reckoning. It is an absolute horror story of what occurred there in suppressing what they thought were the did they think the Mao were part of a communist group, or I mean,
they knew perfectly well that they weren't.
Okay.
I mean, there was no communist influence within the resistance, Kenyan resistance. So they may have been tiny groups, but hardly any. It was a classical nationalist anti-colonial resistance. That's what the Mau Rebellion was. And they were treated in the most appalling way. Tortures were carried out on them. There were stories of rapes of women whose husbands were in prison, etc., etc. So, it was a horrific thing, underplayed till very recently. I mean, that's why I praise Caroline Elkins to the skies, because she went out of her way and researched it. So it's undeniable now. And I remember I was debating with some right-wing historians, Niall Ferguson, the British historian who was, after 9/11, given a job at Harvard because they were looking for imperialist historians. And there's an American guy with him who wasn't a fully fledged historian, but a very right-wing Republican ideologue. And when I raised the question of Kenya, we had this debate in Macalester College in Minneapolis. And when I raised the question of Kenya, they both raised their hands. Oh, Kenya, nothing happened there. After Caroline Elkins's book came out, they have not been able to say that. They can't deny it. And I think Ferguson may even have put some reference in his latest books to that. But prior to that, they thought it could just be covered up. And that's why I think all scholars, whatever their views, owe a huge debt to Caroline Elkins. I mean, the two books she's written, on Kenya and then just on the British Empire, absolutely indispensable books. And it's interesting. They come from US historians, not from British historians.
Right. Concentration camps, castration, abuse, torture, systematic torture, mass executions, and this is in 1952. And that brings me back to the Queen. The Queen died, and we have all this wonderful stories, and it should be a time to expose some of the war crimes, I think, that were a part of, I don't know if she was complicit under it, but she had to be aware. She had to be aware of this. They had to be aware of what was going on in 1952 in Kenya. I don't know. Frustrating.
Well, of course they were aware. Yeah, they were aware of it. But this was, part of that.
Would we not be remiss in not seeing, just pointing the finger at British imperialism? I mean, the French have had empires, the Spanish had empires. These are features of imperialism in general, are they not? They're not just features of, there's nothing peculiar of the Queen or even when
it's because
they're
the royal
iconic,
family
but
is sort of semi-worshipped as well. And so it's their own past in the empire is often forgotten or covered up, whereas the French, etc., were republics, and they carried out all this stuff. I mean, and if you go back to the early years of empire, the Spanish Empire in South America is probably the most astonishing achievement by a European power. Spain and Portugal took a whole continent, whereas Britain only got North America, and then the North Americans chucked them out and they were left with Canada, whereas the Spanish hung on there for some time. It is a European thing, you're absolutely right. The Germans were the ones who couldn't develop a large empire, which is why in the First and Second World Wars were largely, not exclusively, but largely, the First World War completely imperial war, saying why should we be left out? Just look at the size of Germany now, unified Germany, with Prussia as its heart, and compare how much we've got compared to the French and the Brits, etc. And Hitler made this point regularly. This is the space. This is German space. And look at our colonies. Then look at the British space and the French space and look at their colonies. Why should we tolerate this? So they wanted to share the world like they'd shared Africa, in a previous century.
I'd like to talk to you about how Churchill had been elevated to this figure of great importance, similar to how Ronald Reagan, when he left office, he had horrible, polling. And then 20 years later, he's this god. In 2002, 100 Greatest Brits BBC poll, and you could choose from Darwin, Shakespeare, Newton, even Lennon and McCartney. But who was number one? Churchill. Churchill was considered the greatest Brit. And this is 20 years after the Falklands War, which you said kind of started the elevation of this myth, this cult surrounding him. It used to this day.
With Ronald Reagan, who you also mentioned, it's very interesting to see that it's one thing the Republicans loving him because that's what he was, and a virulently right-wing one. But when you heard Clinton and Obama being interviewed and asked who their favorite president was, they said Ronald Reagan, because they'd shifted consensually in changing what was the United States from the New Deal. This was a huge break. So with Churchill, it wasn't the same. With Churchill, it was that they needed Churchill to use him during the Falklands War, which was a war they would never have won without U.S. support and General Pinochet's support in Chile. They would have lost that war. So once again, the U.S. came to the rescue and told Pinochet, you better back them and let them use Chilean ports to get the Falklands back. But the way it was presented in Parliament, both by Margaret Thatcher, as those who were opposed to the war, as some conservatives were, and a number of Labour MPs, that they were appeasers, using the word that had been used by Churchill against his opponents, or by Churchill supporters against Churchill's opponents, appeasers, appeasing Hitler, appeasing Galtieri in Argentina. And Michael Foot, otherwise, sort of soft guy, basically leader of the Labour Party from the left, joined in, backing Thatcher, saying how good she was, how necessary it was, and recalling Churchill. So the Churchill cult, if you like, the new cult of Churchill, which was sort of slowly dying out, in my opinion. I mean, was revived in quite a sharp and vicious way during the Falklands War, and ever since. I mean, they revived it a bit. During the Iraq War, Saddam was described as a Hitler. They described Gaddafi as a Hitler. They described Assad as a Hitler. The mullahs were Hitlers. And the reason for that is the only decent memory the Brits have is actually the wartime memory that they won that war. So constantly reviving that became part and parcel of the ideological offensives waged by the British state in its various forms.
And then MSNBC, which is our very liberal cable news, just last week, Churchill's name came up by some pundit, some military pundit, about how when the Ukrainian president came to the Congress, this was a Churchillian moment. They bring up this anytime the right wing wants to expand their military power or interventions, they always elevate it to a Churchillian moment. And that's what's so great about your book, is to knock this down a notch and say, wait a second, this wasn't a great person, wasn't necessarily a great military leader, had a horrible impact on a lot of our 20th century, and doesn't deserve praise, deserves condemnation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, God knows when it will change. But one reason to write the book was to at least start a debate. But the liberals really here are more at fault, because the right is prepared to debate and does in its own way, in its own press. The liberals basically don't like to debate this issue because, they know that most, of the stuff they will read in this book is totally accurate. Then how would they defend it,
Yeah.
They've moved so much in the United States and in Britain, liberals and social democrats, that they would prefer not to have a debate at all and concentrate the debate only against very obvious targets like, Trump, for instance, or people associated with him. Well, which sane person could disagree with that, but it's not, it's anything that's slightly difficult, they stay away from.
Well, it's not new. It's in this country.
No, it's
we've had
not
that.
new.
McCarthyism, the enablers of McCarthyism. It's easy to pin the blame on the right wingers, the crazies, but the liberals were complicit. I mean, they were the people that allowed it to happen. They're the people that urged it on. They're the people that were throwing their friends under the bus, and so on. And so we just have repeats of this, and the center doesn't hold in the United States. The center doesn't hold. It always it swings to the right.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the United States, in its recent past, I think it reached its highest point with the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. I mean, that was no other imperial country has ever produced, despite itself, obviously, an anti-war movement which went that deep. So much so that in the early 70s, GIs in their uniforms retired with, cripples on crutches, demonstrating their medals, including some of the top military medals they'd received, and demonstrating outside the Pentagon. And saying they wanted the US to lose the war. There is no other example of that in imperial history. And that, I think, is to the enormous credit of the United States and its people, those who resisted. It's after that they stopped conscription and went for hiring mercenaries. Because once you have conscription and you're fighting an unpopular war, everyone or anyone whose child is fighting in that war discusses it at breakfast. What's the latest news from Vietnam? What the hell is going on there? So whether you like it or not, citizens have never shown the slightest interest prior to this in world politics get interested. And I think they have prevented that from happening in the Iraq War and in the Middle Eastern wars of the 21st century. But that is a memory which certainly the left and liberals should try and keep alive, not in an idealized way, but that it was something of extreme importance that happened to a country at war, that it threw up an anti-war movement without any parallels certainly in recent imperial history.
And you've been fighting that fight for a long time back, and it wasn't necessarily popular to be fighting in 1968 against the war in the streets and so forth. But you've been there. You've been I don't think I think this is accurate. You've been a hero of mine. You've been a hero of mine. I've followed your career, and you're is it true that Mick Jagger actually wrote Street Fighting Man about you in the London streets and the anti-war rallies, which you were a part of back then? Or is that just
yeah, it is. It is true. And John Lennon was equally supportive of us and wrote songs for the movement, Power to the People, he wrote for us. And there was at that time a surge, including in the United States. I mean, if you look at some of the songs of the groups, but also of Dylan. I mean, some of Dylan's most powerful songs were written in the late 60s and 70s, O Ye Masters of War. I mean, still apposite today, quite honestly. So that radicalization went quite deep and affected large parts of the culture, the political culture of the country. It's very different times now, but still, some of us try.
And I'd like to end on maybe one more light topic, but have you watched the Meghan and Harry Netflix series about the documentary series? It is surprisingly.
I haven't watched it all.
Right. It's surprisingly good because it's two stories. One, it's a kind of a love story between these people that seem to be good people. But the bigger story is the whole taking down the monarchy and how problematic they have been in their footprint across the world, and how and they go deeply to the problem with the monarchy and their relationship with tabloids and so forth. So it's as much political as it is just fluff Hollywood.
It is. I mean, it was regarded, yeah, it wasn't a puff job. It was basically quite a cynical set of documentaries.
Correct.
And they put in stuff which surprised me, about how they operated, how the system worked, etc., etc. And you'd have thought that it would have been enough, but the figures supplied by the networks as to how many people watched King Charles's Christmas Day speech, 10 million. It's as if they're made of Teflon. 10 million people watched Charles's speech on television on Christmas Day 2022.
Oh, goodness.
So, they seem to be, nothing seems to touch them. I'm sure sooner or later they will go. But when, it's difficult to say.
Any final thoughts, Greg?
No, I think that summarizes it. It's kind of a down note, but I have to agree. It's not. These are exciting times. That's the best I can say. They're very exciting times, but hopefully the new year will bring a fight back. It'll bring a rising. more risings. We'll have some good stories to tell a year from now.
Well, thank you so much for being on. Your book is absolutely
Yeah, no,
wonderful.
thanks very much for doing the talk. Yeah.
And Greg and I devoured it, and we.
And you send me a link. You send me. Make sure you send me a link so I can put it up. Yeah.
I will send you a link. Well, it's been great to talk to you across the pond, and keep doing good work. Thank you.
Right.
Right.